Hello, people everywhere. We are back with the podcast created for Christ's Word. Today, we are going to finish up the story of Esther. We started with the first two episodes, seeing Esther enter into an uncomfortable position as queen. Though it was tough, Esther learned to accept her position and understand God made her queen for a reason. Now, we are going to finish the story and see how God used Esther to save her people. Let's deep dive into the story. We start our story with Esther, about to go before the king and convince the king to beg for mercy for her people. And if you remember the last episode, Esther couldn't just go to the king unless he invited her to come before him. If she went to the king uninvited, she could lose her life. So here's what happened. Esther 5, 1 through 8. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight. And basically, this is from the King James. It's either King James or New King James. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you." Basically meaning, what is it that she wants? "What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I have prepared for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So Esther basically went to the king, and he was assigned whether or not the sign would be if the king held out the scepter, right? Because remember, it was still legal to go to the king uninvited. But if the king hold out the scepter, then it was a sign that it was safe to come, and you would touch the scepter. So he asks her, what is it that she requests? And she tells him that she wants to have a banquet him and Haman. with him and Haman. And basically what she planned to do was expose Haman at that feast. So when she asked him what is it that she wanted, then she just asked to have another feast the next day. She didn't expose Haman on the first feast. She had everything planned out. Because remember, she could have just said it right there, but I think she wanted to have it play out a certain way. So Queen Esther hosted the banquet for Haman and Xerxes the next day. After the banquet, she asked the king if she would host another banquet the next day, and the king agreed. Haman, however, left joyously from the banquet and went home where he had an idea. Haman, he hated Mordecai. Him and Mordecai had a sort of, he was a sworn enemy, and they had a rivalry. And Haman looked forward to the day where the decree would be made fulfilled, right? Where he convinced the king to sign the law to get rid of the Jews, including Mordecai. So basically, Haman looked forward to seeing his sworn enemy, Mordecai, his death, that he was so excited for it that he built a whole gallows to hang Mordecai on in his backyard. He planned to hang Mordecai on in his own backyard. Now, let's take a break. Now, let's go to King Xerxes. One night, King Xerxes could not sleep. So he had his servant read his book of records of the Chronicles, which is basically the timelines from basically his timeline as king. While his servant read the book of the different times and moments, the servant read a section of the time that mentioned how Mordecai saved the king from being assassinated from his two eunuchs. If you remember the second episode, Mordecai saved the king from being assassinated by two of his servants. And hearing his servant read about what Mordecai, he asked what was done to honor him. He wanted to honor him. So he asked the servant if they did anything to show his respect towards him. The servant replied, nothing. Suddenly Haman entered the court, and the king asked his servants to bring Haman to him. Listen what happened next. Esther 6:6-11. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought with the king, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on his head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on the horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and get this, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on the horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So Haman, so basically the king asked Haman what would be done to somebody who honors the king. And Haman was so high-minded, so prideful that he thought it had to be him. So he gave him all the idea. He said if it was him, that he would ride on a horse, on the king's horse, use the king's robe, and honor would be in to ride around the streets of Persia. So when he found out that it wasn't him, but it was Mordecai, the king told him to do all this for Mordecai. And the next day, after he finished honoring Mordecai, like the king told him, he went home to his wife and friends. I guess no one ever told Haman that pride goes before a fall. And the next day, Haman went to Esther's banquet, right? And let's see how the banquet goes. Let's see how it goes. Esther 8:1-10. So the king and Haman went to dine at Queen Esther. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before our Queen Esther, pleading for his life. For he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where the Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. So this time, on the second one, Esther revealed to the king that Haman had been behind all this. And so he had Haman hung on the same gallows he built up for Mordecai publicly for everyone to see. Now that Haman has been taken care of, the king can now see what he can do for Esther. He wants to help Esther, but he still can't change the law he already made. So, and here's what happened in Esther 9, 1-5. Here's what the king did to solve this problem. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work, helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. The Jews, the king allowed, so he made a new decree to basically go against the other one. He decreed that all the Jews could use weapons to defeat their enemies when the time came for his old law that Haman tricked him into making come to pass. So when the time came, the Jews overpowered them with their weapons, and anyone that sought to harm any of the Jews was defeated. And they feared Mordecai because Mordecai was high in the king's palace. So they just decided to back off and leave the Jews alone. The Jews were saved, and they had a feast called the Feast of Purim. This feast is still celebrated today by the Jewish nation to remember how they were saved from death and how Esther saved her people. Mordecai took Haman's place as the highest ranking official, and Esther ruled many years, and that is the story of Esther. That was an amazing story. This is an amazing story. It's one that we can remember and we can apply to our lives. There are so many things we can learn from this story, but I'm only going to give you a few points. However, before we get into our points, there's something I want to share with you about this story. I don't know if you noticed, but if you read the whole book of Esther, and I'm pretty sure it has 10 chapters, I believe, God's name is not mentioned in one verse. Not one chapter, not one verse. And why am I saying this? This is key because even when it seems like God is silent and non-existent, even when he doesn't speak or you don't feel his presence, and even though it feels like God is not mentioned like he should be, he's still working things. You may not see him, you may not hear him, but God moves and demonstrates his power, sometimes silently. And a lot of times people think that they hear God. People think that we hear God with just as some big loud voice calling to us, but no. God moves and speaks to us in the still small voice. Now, let's get into our point. And here's another thing. Esther was a young girl, right? And many of you are young girls. And you may not be a queen, but spiritually, you can have the same abilities Esther did. Like Esther, you can stand up for your faith. And I believe that for this next generation, that God is going to bring up some powerful young women of God, because a woman of God is a very powerful person, and they're no one to be underestimated by. So I believe that, like Esther, we need powerful young Esthers and women of God. So let's get into our points. Number 1, God pushes us sometimes out of our comfort zone. We saw this a lot. Esther didn't ask to be the queen, but that's what God placed her. He may have not told her that she was going to be the queen, or he may have not talked to her at all, but still. God put her out of her comfort zone. And anyone who tells you that living for Jesus and following Jesus and being a Christian would be easy and comfort, then it's a lie. Following Jesus, you should always expect trials. You should always be on guard to try something different. And following Jesus means that you will not be full of comfort always. God is going to use you, but sometimes it takes sacrifices. Esther had to make a sacrifice to give up her old lifestyle. She was doing fine. But God wanted her to be queen because he was going to demonstrate his power to save the Jews. Number 2, we cannot be silent in times of trouble. Esther 4:14 said that perhaps Esther had come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai told her that if she is silent, then deliverance would come from somewhere else. Now, deliverance may have came from somewhere else. It could have come from somewhere else, but even Esther wouldn't be saved. And she knew that she couldn't be silent, and she just had to make a commitment. Later on, the verse said, "If I perish, I perish." And we have to make a commitment that if we perish, we perish. If we die, we die. But we will not be silent and let the world shut us up and keep us from professing in our faith as young people. Because many people think that us as youth, that we don't have a voice. We do. And our voice is to follow Christ. That's what we're here to do. We're here to stand up for Christ. So our voices are not to be heard. But if we're just going to be silent, be a part of the crowd, and not stand up for God, then yes, deliverance may come from somewhere else, but God wants to use us. And if God wants to use me, I wouldn't be silent. I would speak up and do something about the call of God on my life. And finally, number 3, evil will never succeed. Haman thought he had the Jews. He thought he could hang Mordecai. He thought he could kill Mordecai, and he thought he could get Mordecai to bow down to him. And as you can see, we saw how it didn't end for him. And let me just say this. It doesn't matter how much the devil thinks he's winning. It doesn't matter how much it seems like the devil has taken control of the school systems, taking care of the church systems, or just taking care of or just winning. It's just winning, period. It doesn't matter how much it looks like the devil is winning. He's already defeated by the cross. Jesus died on the cross, and it may look like he's winning, but we have to remember that he's already lost. And there's coming a day where the Satan will be thrown into hell, and he will live there for eternity, burning, because we have the victory. And if we know we win in the end, then we win right now. So evil never wins. We win now. We've won in the past. We won in the present. And we're going to win in the future. Because if we win in the future, we're winning right now. Thank you for listening to Creative for Christ's Word. Be sure to like and share, and I'll see you real soon.